Welcome back everyone to another reaction video. Well, today is August 1st, 2024, and it was 80 years ago today that the last entry was made in a diary that has become one of the best-selling nonfiction books of all time. And it wasn't written by a famous author with dozens of books to her credit. It wasn't written by some seasoned professional. It was written by a teenage girl who had been hiding in an attic for 2 years. Most people are familiar with the story of Anne Frank, and so today we're going to dive into her story a little deeper. I'm wearing my I Accept Rachel's Challenge shirt today. Many of you have heard me talk about Rachel's Challenge and my work with them, and we share Anne Frank's story as a part of that because Anne Frank was one of the inspirations for Rachel Joy Scott and one of the reasons why she kept diaries that we often use in Rachel's Challenge. And there's a connection there, too, that Miep Gies, who I'm sure we're going to talk about, who was responsible for hiding the Franks, ended up late in life finding out about Rachel's story and connecting with Rachel's dad and stepmom. And in fact, they visited her just a few days before she died at the age of 100. So there's kind of that little bit of a tangential personal connection for me to the story. And just frankly, Anne Frank is one of my heroes, because she faced the worst of humanity at a time when teenagers could be overwhelmed by emotions and hormones and all these sorts of things, and she faced it with an incredible amount of grace and class, talked about kindness, talked about dreams for the future, and there's no doubt why she has gone down in history as a hero to so many people, especially to young women. So we're going to take a look at her story today with the channel Biographics. I'll put a link down in the description so you can check it out without my commentary. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
Welcome back to Biographics. I'm your host, Eric Malachite, and today's video is one that has been a long time coming. We are discussing the inspiring and tragic story of Anne Frank, a quiet young writer whose words would go on to inform the world of the horrors, not of World War II on the fields and skies of battle, but of the Holocaust going on in the background. Powerful words that would not only win a Pulitzer, but also inspire world leaders like Nelson Mandela to fight against prejudice, with a script authored by Justin Crockett. If you enjoyed today's video, then be sure to check out his website, which will be linked in the description.
So I've been trying to think about all the reasons why people seem to connect to her story so much, and I think a lot of it's obvious, but I think this goes to a larger issue, which is that when we talk about big numbers, when we talk about 6 million Jews, and it's important to note that it wasn't just Jews that died in the Holocaust. There were millions of others: Russians, gypsies, homosexuals, the infirmed, people with disabilities. Jews just made up the single biggest individual group, subgroup of all of the people who were killed in the Holocaust. When we talk about those numbers, it can be, 6 million is a huge number when we start really thinking about it. But our mind can't process that the way that it can a teenage girl and her sister and her mother, especially when we start to hear her story and we start to have descriptions of exactly what she went through. It doesn't mean that Anne Frank's story is any more important than anyone else's, and it doesn't mean that her life mattered more than anybody else's. But it's a way for us to connect to the story in a way we otherwise might not. It's the same reason why when I go to places like the Somme battlefield, I can talk about 19,000 British soldiers being killed in a couple hours on the morning of July 1st, 1916, and that's just a number. But when I start reading to you the diary entry of Charlie May that he wrote contemplating not seeing his wife and daughter again, and when I read about a guy like Noel Hodgson and the poem that he wrote a few days before he died, then it starts to connect to us on a personal level in a way it might not otherwise when we just read numbers. I think that's why it matters.
Also, as a note, due to the nature of the content, I will be refraining from making side commentary in this video. With that said, let us begin. Of all the staggeringly heart-wrenching stories that came out of World War II and the Holocaust, one that has endured the longest is the tale of Anne Frank. During the systematic murder of over 6 million Jews, the German death machine led by Adolf Hitler carried out horrific acts with surgical efficiency. Anne Frank evaded that machine for so long, but her fate was tragically sealed almost from the beginning.
I believe what they just showed there is my understanding is that's the only known actual video footage of Anne Frank sticking her head out that window.
Anne Frank was caught up in the middle of this whirlwind during Hitler's rise to power. As a young Jewish girl born in Germany, her family quickly saw what was going down in the country and moved to the Netherlands. There, she began writing the diary that would become a world-famous account of the Holocaust, something that was very necessary to make the whole ordeal personal for people who may not have known the details or scope of what had happened. For over 2 years, Frank and her family hid in a makeshift room behind a bookcase in an Amsterdam building where her father worked.
So if you ever go to the World War II Museum in New Orleans, they actually have a recreation of what they call the Annex, which is where the Frank family and another family were hiding. It includes that open bookshelf there. You can go to Amsterdam and see the actual, what they call the Anne Frank house, but you can't film inside of it. So I did film some footage of the one in the World War II Museum. So when my video from that site goes up, you'll be able to see that.
The entire time there, until she was captured by the Nazis, Anne would write her thoughts and dreams into her diary, while the world outside her hidden walls went to hell. After the Second World War ended, a few helpful hands saw to it that Anne's diary was made available to the world. It has since been a brutal reminder of what humanity can be capable of at its worst, and what humanity is at its best. Here is a single brave girl's story of survival in fear in one of the darkest chapters in history.
One of the things I love about her story is that while she's in the middle of going through this, and listen, I'm going to be 47 this coming week. I would have a hard time staying positive in a situation like that, where I had to hide with my family for 2 years, only because of who we are, because of our background. I can't imagine how a 14, 15-year-old girl did that and kept positive. But she would write things like about how she still believed that mankind in its nature was good. And she talked about you can always give something, even if it's only kindness. She was just a remarkable human being at a time when we needed some remarkable human beings.
The girl that the world would come to know as Anne Frank was born on June 12, 1929, at a Red Cross clinic in Frankfurt, Germany. Her birth name was Annalisa, and her parents were Edith and Otto Frank, two Jewish folks who didn't necessarily practice all the customs. Her birth home was a little rental in a mixed religious neighborhood on an unassuming street. Otto helped run a bank that his father had founded, and the family lived on 2 floors of the rental house along with Anne's older sister, Margot. It didn't take long before Anne and her family saw what was going on in Germany, with the rise of fascism and Adolf Hitler in the early 1930s.
So you got to, context here. Anne Frank's born in 1929. The Nazis come to power in 1933. So basically, her entire life that she could remember involved the Nazis being in power. And some more context: she was born the same year as Martin Luther King Jr. and as oh gosh, I just completely blanked out on a name. But I'll show you what I mean. Just take a look at this. Martin Luther King, Anne Frank, Bob Newhart, who just passed away, in the last couple of weeks? Anne Frank could have still been alive. Easily still been alive today. Audrey Hepburn, Grace Kelly, Jackie Kennedy was born that same year. Yasser Arafat, Ed Asner. Barbara Walters is who I was thinking of earlier. Arnold Palmer, Christopher Plummer, June Carter Cash. These are people that we know that lived as adults and even to old people. And this young girl died 80 years ago. Before anybody corrects me, I know she died in 1945. It was 79 years ago. I'm just rounding.
The Nazi Party that was eagerly imposing their will on the country elected Hitler as the Chancellor of the Reich. Anne's mother packed the girls up and moved.
They didn't elect Hitler as Chancellor. Chancellor was an appointed position. The president was elected. Hitler lost the presidential election, got appointed as chancellor.
Them to a more northern city in Germany, as her father remained in Frankfurt to tie up loose ends, and the family was well aware they weren't long for their home country. The Franks packed their bags and left for Amsterdam in the Netherlands in 1933. When Otto received a job offer that facilitated their move between 1933 and 1939, when circumstances and quality of life for Jewish people in Germany were rapidly deteriorating, around 300,000 Jews Jews migrated away from the country.
So this is why Anne's diary is written in Dutch, not in German, because she was 4 years old when they left Germany. Even though they were German, she was 4 years old when they went to the Netherlands, and so she had grown up in the Netherlands.
Frank settled nicely into their new digs as her dad started working at a fruit extract company, and the two daughters got enrolled in school.
She realized there was a cat on the shelf behind him, moving around.
Anne began studying at the 6th Montessori School in 1934, and while she had some trouble adjusting to the Dutch language, she soon showed herself to be an exceptional student. The school would eventually bear her name in 1957. The family of four began laying down their own roots in an area of Amsterdam where many other German refugees of the Jewish faith had settled. Her dad started up a company of his own in 1938 that specialized in herbs and spices used for sausage production. Anne felt more and more like she was at home in her school and struck up fast friendships. That little bit of stability and peace came to a halt in 1940, when the Germans, who had already started invading countries like Poland and Denmark, set their sights on the Netherlands. Almost immediately, the Franks began running into the same kind of religious and ethnic persecution that made them flee Germany.
So in the Netherlands, you also have Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was, the emperor of Germany and king of Prussia in the First World War, and then he fled. The country had to leave. He abdicated, and he went to the Netherlands, lived in Doorn, which is not real far from Amsterdam. Of course, nowhere in the Netherlands is far from Amsterdam because it's a very small country, but he lived the rest of his days there, and he was still living there when the Germans conquered the Netherlands and then died during the war.
Father noticed this and thought that escaping to the United States was their only bet for safety. He filled out applications for visas for the family, but tragically they were never processed because German bombings that were commencing in the Netherlands destroyed the consulate building where all of that paperwork was kept.
Not only that, but the United States was turning back a lot of Jews who were coming there seeking refuge. In fact, there was a ship that arrived in the United States full of Jewish refugees that was turned away, and many of those people ended up dying in the Holocaust.
It appeared that they were stuck in Amsterdam for the time being. This was just after the summer of 1941. Germany was literally lashing out against the whole of Europe and had just attacked Russia, whom they had signed a peace treaty with several years before. After the Germans invaded Amsterdam, the occupying forces that took over set into place.
Maybe I'm being really critical here, hypercritical, but it wasn't a peace treaty. A peace treaty typically ends a war. It was a non-aggression pact. It's a we won't go to war against you, not a let's end the fighting.
All sorts of restrictions and regulations regarding Jewish citizens. They were made to register with the new regime and were subject to residential and educational segregation. Indeed, Anne would lose her spot in her beloved school and instead began to attend a Jewish school in another part of the city. Things would continue to deteriorate rapidly for Anne, her family, and countless others around the continent. Anne Frank turned 13 in June 1942. One of her presents was a little book with blank pages meant to be used for collecting autographs. It had a small lock on the front of it which inspired Anne to use it as a diary. Yes, that diary. She adorably named it Kitty, and very soon took to filling its pages with all the thoughts and dreams of a teenage girl. Right around the time that she did begin making entries, however, the German occupying forces began the process of deporting Jews out of the Netherlands and congregating them all in various labor camps around Europe.
So people forget that the Holocaust as we know it didn't start right away. It ramped up to that. It escalated to that point. You had things like Kristallnacht in 1938 where Jewish businesses were destroyed, and you had books being burned, and you had people being rounded up and put in ghettos and things like that. You had where they had to start wearing the Star of David. It isn't until you get into 1942 that the mass extermination begins, after they have the Wannsee Conference, where they come up with what they call the final solution to the Jewish question. There had been talk of deportation, of forced sterilization, of using them all for slave labor, which they continued to do slave labor. In fact, that's what's going to happen to the Franks. But it wasn't immediate that these things were going on.
July of 1942, Anne's parents sensed that they were about to be targeted for their own forced relocation, and Margot actually got her written notice that she was going to be assigned to a work camp. It's likely that the family didn't know the full scale of the Nazis' plans for the Jewish race, as evidenced by little actions like the parents asking neighbors to watch the family cat, or Anne asking friends to look after her possessions. And so it was that the Franks found maybe the most famous hiding spot in history, as they congregated in a side room above the spice company that her dad helped run. The Achterhaus, which was slang for backhouse or secret annex, housed the Frank family in complete secrecy behind a meager bookcase, which concealed the only entrance. Only a few of Otto's most trusted employees knew that they were living inside, because that's exactly what they had to do: live in secret for the next 2 years. Her father's confidants would provide them with food, as well as regular updates on what was going on in the city outside their walls, and the war that was now engulfing the entire world.
If you want a great look at this story, the story of Miep Gies, who's the woman who's most responsible for helping the Frank family do this, there's I think it's an Amazon series called A Small Light. It's fantastic. Wonderful story. Miep was an incredibly brave woman.
Their trusted circle kept them safe during routine inspections, which put them in danger of great harm, as any non-Jew that was caught sheltering Jews would surely face the harshest possible sentence. Not too long after setting up their makeshift hideout inside the Achterhaus, they were joined by another family of 3 who were fleeing the Nazis. The Van Pels family irked Anne at first, even if she was briefly happy to have new faces to converse with. She thought they were a bit selfish, took up too much of the already too limited space, and ate too much of the food that was getting increasingly hard to come by.
Yeah, these are all very reasonable things to feel. And listen, Anne Frank's diary is not all sunshine and roses the whole time. It's her being honest about her feelings, about her situation, about her fears, about what angered her. It's all just real. It's real.
She did take to the 16-year-old Peter after some time, however. While first labeling him as a shy, withdrawn type, she did enter into a sweet teenage romance with him. Peter was her first kiss, but thoughtful Anne did wonder if it was because she was actually attracted to him, or if it was because they were forced to share the same space, and he was the most agreeable of the new tenants. These attractions, feelings about household tensions, and thoughts about the state of her relationship with her family members were all ideas Anne Frank laid out in her diary, which was honestly becoming her best friend of all. She often held jealous emotions toward Margot, which seemed to stem from everyone around her praising Margot's natural warm kindness. And
again, a perfectly normal thing for a teenage girl to feel about her big sister. And you know what? People take to writing to process stuff they can't otherwise process. That's why we have such incredibly beautiful poetry that came out of the First World War. Men were facing the worst of humanity, the worst conditions imaginable, and they were trying to figure out a way to process that and to deal with it. And many of them turned to writing, just as Anne Frank did.
Anne was a little more blunt, but their forced closeness in the new situation did seem to cool things off a little bit. One such entry in her diary shows what Anne seemed to think of Margot's burgeoning maturity. Margot's much nicer. She's not nearly so catty these days and is becoming a real friend. She no longer thinks of me as a little baby who doesn't count. Anne loved her father most of all, her writings seemed to show. That strong love sometimes manifested in negative feelings toward her mother Edith. For a long time she harbored resentment, which in hindsight was most likely young teenage feelings that often get targeted towards one's parents. Anne went so far as to write, "She's not a mother to me." Being as thoughtful as she was, she later looked back on these entries with regret. Cringiness is something that many modern people can probably relate to in regards to their old online posts and diaries. Anne, in her rare times when she wasn't documenting her life, never gave up on her love for education. Months and months passed by until the sequestering just became another routine. But she and her sister prayed for the days when they could return to formal schooling. They both did correspondence courses as much as they could, getting good grades probably due to having all the time in the world to be inside studying.
So if you think about this, if you're a parent, you're going to try to make this as bearable as possible for your kids. And you would think, well, man, they're making them do schoolwork, but having a routine, feeling like they weren't just hiding and worrying, giving them something to focus their mind on other than their situation, important stuff.
As Anne grew, so did her thoughts and beliefs. From age 12 to 14, an adolescent teen literally screams with change. Anne went from missing her beloved family cat to more complex ideals like questioning humans and the existence of God. She even allowed herself the requisite teenage sexual jokes and musings. Her writing took on a life of its own, so much so that she decided that when she got out of her miserable, secluded surroundings, she would become a journalist.
Yep.
It only made sense.
She said, my dream is to be a journalist and later on a famous writer, and I want my writings, to have an impact on the world. She really did believe that she was going to be a famous writer, and she was 100% right about that. She just didn't get to live to see it.
And she had plenty of practice. She confided in her diary that even if she didn't write for a job, she could do it for herself. She had the very mature thought that simply being a wife and mother wasn't all the purpose that she wanted. She desired to have something of her own, a meaning in a world that was making less and less sense every day. On Tuesday, August 1st, 1944, she looked again for meaning. She addressed the entry to Kitty. She examined why she felt she had two sides of her personality. One cheerful and extroverted, and the other more refined and subdued. She fought with herself on those pages, annoyed that she had to almost put on a face so that her true self did not risk being vulnerable, exposed, or hurt. Her exasperation at being let down by people made her end the entry with, "If only there were no other people in the world." 3 days later, the Germans would storm the building, discover the Achterhaus, and Anne's innermost thoughts about people would, in this case, be proven true.
So the diary, I'm sure they'll talk about it, diary gets left behind. Meep actually rescues the diary from being destroyed and later on gives it to Anne's father after the war's over.
It was the morning of August 4th, 1944, when the police and the notorious German SS force barged their way into the hidden confines that housed the Franks and their few forced neighbors. The causes of them being discovered and arrested haven't entirely been clear. One theory is that a relative of one of Otto's trusted employees was a Nazi sympathizer for some time and had a problem with the way their father was helping and harboring Jewish people.
Yeah, there's a lot of speculation. It's pretty clear somebody betrayed them, and since very few people knew that they were there, unless there was somebody who just saw something and kind of guessed what was happening, it's a good chance that it was somebody close to the families.
Other more modern discoveries offer alternative theories for the betrayal, from random ration card fraud investigations to networks of informants who helped German authorities root out other Jews.
All possible.
Anne and her family didn't have time to care about who ratted them out, as they were immediately taken for interrogation at the headquarters of RSHA, which was the Reich security complex that was headed by the infamous Nazi Heinrich Himmler. Once the Franks were processed and held overnight, they made a few stops at various prisons before arriving at the Westerbork labor camp. Here, because of their status as criminals who were hiding from the law, they were put in an area of camp that performed more strenuous work as their punishment dictated. Not all of the small team of Otto's employees and friends who tried to keep them safe in their hideout were arrested. In fact, 2 secretaries who aided the Franks during that time came back to the Achterhaus to retrieve a few of the Franks' photo albums. During their quick sweep of the area, they noticed a bunch of pages in Anne's handwriting strewn about. They smartly held on to them, realizing they might have some significance. Anne, her mother and father, and Margot were at Westbork for only about a month before they were put on a fateful train to Auschwitz, the concentration camp in Poland. They arrived at the death camp on September 6, 1944. Otto Frank was immediately separated from the other 3.
It's important to note Auschwitz wasn't just an extermination camp. It was also, there were multiple camps, and it was also a forced labor camp. And this is where they would sort the people. It's very clinical when you describe it this way, but basically what they're doing is they're sorting who has some benefit to the Reich and who is just a waste of space and air and food and needs to be exterminated right away. And so those people were sent to extermination. The others were sent to forced labor camps, and all 4 of the Franks were kept alive at that point
and deemed fit to work. As was policy at Auschwitz, anyone under the age of 15 was immediately sent to the gas chambers and killed, and Frank had turned 15 just a few months prior, so she, Edith, and Margot were selected to work in a different part of the camp than her father. It's important to note that, because if she had been
caught a year earlier, she probably would have been exterminated. And a lot of people, I don't think, realize this. Anne Frank was not sent to a gas chamber. She died of illness just a few weeks before the camp she was at was liberated.
She knew he was already dead, like most of the people who arrived at Auschwitz. Like most prisoners at the camp, she was forced to have her head shaved, and her prisoner number was tattooed on her arm. The section of the camp where she worked had the inmates hauling rocks and laying sod. Being as clever as she was, Anne was able to obtain extra bread and items for her mother and sister. When they weren't working excruciating hours, they were all stuffed into barracks, where overcrowding led to disease and death for many. Anne herself developed numerous skin infections, to the point where she and Margot were put into an infirmary. You might be picturing a sterile medical environment, but even this place was murky, dark, and pest-ridden. Anne's mother, who was basically starving herself to ensure the girls ate something, would pass bits of bread to them through the crumbling infirmary walls. Anne's scabies infection actually prevented her from being sent to another labor camp in October 1944, but she and her sister were shipped to another notorious death camp later that month. As Allied forces worked to push the Germans back to their home country, more and more concentration camps throughout Europe were liquidated, and prisoners sent closer and closer to Germany. This meant that the Frank sisters ended up in the Bergen-Belsen camp in northern Germany. Of the nearly 8,000 prisoners who were relocated, Edith Frank was not one of them. She would soon die at Auschwitz of starvation and disease. Anne was not faring much better at Bergen-Belsen. Conditions were atrocious, as authorities had put up makeshift tents to handle the overwhelming amounts of people who were flowing into the camp. She was emaciated, starving, and exhausted. She came across two friends from back home in all the chaos at the camp. She was able to converse with them here and there, but her acquaintances were well taken aback by her appearance. Everyone was seemingly resigned to their fates.
So I've mentioned this here and there, but my daughter, my 19-year-old daughter, who we named Rachel Joy, we named her after Rachel Scott, who was inspired by Anne Frank's story. Rachel's boyfriend is actually from an Orthodox Jewish family, and I started doing his family history research and discovered that his great-grandmother was at Bergen-Belsen at the same time that Anne and Margot Frank were there. There's a decent chance they may have known each other. He didn't know that. He knew his family had been in a concentration camp and had survived and come to America after the war, but he had no idea that his great-grandma was in the same place as them. There are the reasons we know so much of Anne and her sister's story from these months. Think about this. This is August. They're captured. Eventually they go to Auschwitz. They're in Bergen-Belsen later on. They're going to die at the end of January, beginning of February. Nobody knows for sure the exact date that Anne and Margot died. But in that time, there are people who survived Bergen-Belsen who interacted with them. And so we have their accounts of those things.
Margot was also terribly sick, and the girls both assumed that their parents were dead. Frank wasn't entirely pessimistic, though. She spoke to her old friends about her desire to turn her diary into a novel once the war was over. She had hope, and she still had ambition. The barbed wire barriers and constant specter of death around her could not entirely kill her will. They would, however, kill her body. Anne Frank died at the age of 15 inside Bergen-Belsen sometime in early 1945, just weeks before the end of World War II.
And not only that, but it was just weeks before the camp was liberated, which happened before the end of the war.
The eventual liberation of all the concentration camps. We don't know the exact cause of her death. Right around that time, there was a typhus outbreak in the camp that claimed the lives of 17,000 inmates. Margot likely suffered the same fate and preceded Anne in death by one day. Otto Frank left Auschwitz in mid-1945 and returned to Amsterdam. He had survived the unspeakable horror of the Holocaust and hoped to now find the rest of his family. Within the next few weeks, he would learn that his beloved wife had died, as well as his two beautiful daughters. Not long after, he spoke to Hermina Gies, one of his secretaries that had worked...
That's Miep. They called her Miep, Gies. And could you just imagine, the guy survived Auschwitz and then has to go, and he probably didn't know right away. It would have taken some work to find out who lived and who died. It took years to start documenting all of this, and there were concerted efforts to document exactly what happened to every person and to try and follow the paper trails and all those sorts of things.
for him at his factory. She also was one of the members of the tight-knit group that helped the Franks hide in their secret annex that was connected to their workplace for over 2 years. She handed over a whole slew of papers that bore the handwriting of his little girl. Within this trove of notebooks was her personal diary. He would never get to hold his daughter Anne again, but he did now have in his hands years of her thoughts, feelings, and loves. Otto was amazed by how meticulous a record Anne had kept during their time in exile.
And I have to give the guy a ton of credit, because it would have been very easy to, as a dad, think, you know what, this isn't for the world. But he also understood that his daughter had a dream, that she wanted, and in fact the world needed to hear this stuff. And so he recognized that importance right away.
He also didn't know how beautiful a private world lived within her head. Anne wasn't the most vocal person in the world, so to hear some of these thoughts for the first time must have floored him. She wrote of a time when the radio was on while they were sequestered away, and hearing a man speak of his wishes for the world to hear about what the Dutch citizens had to endure while the Nazis occupied them. He wanted to collect written records to publish when the time was right, and wanted to submit a writing. The world needed a personal account of these times. Anne was excited. She immediately began editing her diary so that it would be more reader-ready, and she never predicted there would be an ending to her story before she could tell more. Otto saw in these entries just how much she had to share with the world, and was heartbroken at the reality that she would never have the chance now. He decided to gather all of her written works while they were in hiding and let her tell her story posthumously. Anne's proud and devastated father handed off all of this work to a historian colleague of his, who tried to publish it. That didn't work out so well, so her husband wrote a short piece about it in the newspaper, which drummed up some interest from publishers in the Netherlands. Eventually, in 1947, the Dutch people had their first version of the Diary of Anne Frank, though at this stage it was simply called Het Achterhuis, another nod to the back house that did its best to keep them safe as the world burned. The following years would see the book slowly gain audiences in other countries, be turned into a Pulitzer Prize-winning play in New York City, and become part of curriculums in many schools. This meant that many young people Anne's age would have some newfound perspective on just how precious their childhood is.
Highly recommend, if you ever get the chance, to read The Diary of Anne Frank. It is absolutely worth your time.
Anne Frank would become a symbol of the Holocaust as a whole. Her childhood home in Germany and her hiding place in the Netherlands became worldwide landmarks. World leaders and presidents would use her words as ways to temper aggressions between nations, lest the world be thrown into the kind of upheaval that ended her life. Her diary made the world more aware of the Holocaust than maybe any other single work. And that's probably true.
That's 100% true. I guarantee that there is no single writing or video or documentary or movie that has connected as many people with the horrors of what happened as Anne Frank's diary did. I don't think there's any doubt whatsoever that she accomplished that.
I mean, off the top of my head, the most impactful works that I can think of that are similar in their scope would be Schindler's List and Maus by Art Spiegelman, which is sitting behind me on the shelf. If you have a chance to read The Diary of Anne Frank or Maus or both, do it. They're difficult works, but they're important. There's a reason why Maus has won an Eisner Award. Nelson Mandela, the former president of South Africa, may have said it best when he compared her battles with Nazi hatred to his own against the organized racial segregation of apartheid. He remarked that because these beliefs are patently false, and because they were and always will be challenged by the likes of Anne Frank, they are bound to fail. I hope you enjoyed this video.
So just in closing, I want to read just a few quotes from what she wrote. Remember, this is a teenage girl hiding for 2 years without leaving in the annex of a building with another family, crammed into an area so they won't be captured and sent to their deaths because of who they are. She wrote, "How wonderful it is that nobody need wait a single moment before starting to improve the world. How it's really a wonder that I haven't dropped all my ideals because they seem so absurd and impossible to carry out, yet I keep them. Because in spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. Think of all the beauty still left around you and be happy. I can shake off everything as I write. My sorrows disappear. My courage is reborn. No one has ever become poor by giving. And then the last one I'll leave you with is this one. She said, look at how a single candle can both defy and define the darkness. Thanks for watching.